Evan Porter had always been observant, the kind of person who noticed the small rhythms of life, the creak of the floorboards in his mother's old house, the faint smell of cedar from the newly polished furniture, the way sunlight pooled on the wooden countertop in the kitchen each morning. He liked the quiet. He liked noticing things. But today, something about the quiet felt different. The garage smelled of sawdust and oil, thick in the warm autumn air. And there, in the middle of it all, was Lucas Sterling, his stepfather, sleeves rolled up, knuckles brushing against the edge of a splintered table he was painstakingly repairing. Lucas had always fascinated Evan in ways he couldn't articulate. There was a kind of rugged confidence in the way he moved, every motion deliberate, controlled, yet effortless. Watching him lift a heavy board and measure it against the wall, Evan felt a strange pull, a mix of admiration and curiosity that made his stomach tighten. He told himself it was just respect. After all, Lucas was strong, capable, dependable, the kind of man who could build a home with his bare hands. But even as he convinced himself of that, his eyes lingered too long on the flex of Lucas's forearm, the faint lines in his hands, the way a bead of sweat traced a path down his neck. "Careful with that," Evan said, stepping closer, holding a hammer awkwardly in his hands. "You might scratch it." Lucas glanced at him over his shoulder, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I've been doing this longer than you've been alive, kid. But thanks." Evan felt a flush rise in his chest, not from pride, not entirely, but from being seen, acknowledged, and somehow included in this quiet, intimate task. "I can help," he said, and the words tumbled out before he could stop them. "I don't want you to strain yourself." Lucas studied him for a moment, the way someone might consider letting a sparrow into a cage too small for its wings. Then, without a word, he stepped aside, allowing Evan to hold one end of the board. Evan's hands shook slightly under the weight, but Lucas's steady presence beside him was grounding, almost hypnotic. He felt the warmth radiating from Lucas's body, the faint scent of pine and motor oil clinging to his shirt. "Easy," Lucas murmured, guiding Evan's hands. "Just like this." Evan tried to focus on the mechanics, aligning the board, keeping it steady, but he couldn't stop noticing the subtle details, the calluses on Lucas's fingers, the tiny scar near his thumb, the way his jaw clenched when he concentrated. Every movement seemed magnified, every glance loaded with significance Evan wasn't ready to name. He shook his head slightly, as if to dispel the thoughts, but they lingered stubbornly, echoing in his chest. "You've got a good eye," Lucas said finally, nodding. "Better than most people who've tried helping me." Evan's heart skipped a beat at the praise. He wanted to respond, to say something clever, but all that came out was a soft, "Thanks." The simplicity of the word felt inadequate, but Lucas didn't seem to mind. He leaned closer, guiding Evan's hands again, correcting a slight misalignment. The warmth of his arm brushing against Evan's, the careful steadiness, sent a shiver down his spine. For a moment, neither spoke. The only sounds were the rasp of wood against sandpaper, the tap of the hammer, and the low hum of the garage heater. Time seemed to stretch, elastic and weightless, and Evan became acutely aware of the space between them, small, almost imperceptible, yet charged in a way that made him breathe faster. He told himself it was just proximity, just the act of working together, but the way his mind clung to Lucas's every move suggested otherwise. "I wasn't trying to take over," Evan said finally, breaking the silence. I don't like seeing you overwork yourself." Lucas's expression softened. "I get that. But sometimes it's good to have help, even if it's inexperienced help." He chuckled lightly, and the sound made something stir in Evan, something unfamiliar but not unwelcome. They continued working in companionable silence. Evan learned the subtle rhythm of Lucas's movements, how he measured twice, cut once, how he paused to wipe his hands or adjust his stance. There was a kind of intimacy in it, a rhythm they shared without words, and Evan felt both exhilarated and guilty for noticing it so keenly. He told himself it was just observation, just awareness. But deep down, he knew it was more. When they finally set the board in place, Lucas stepped back, wiping his hands on a rag. "Not bad," he said. "You didn't drop it once." Evan smiled, feeling a rush of pride in something else, something he hadn't expected. The tension that had been building in his chest didn't dissipate, it lingered, a quiet echo that seemed to whisper possibilities he wasn't ready to name. "I could help with more," he said cautiously, his voice softer than he intended. "If you need it." Lucas studied him, tilting his head slightly, as if weighing the offer, weighing Evan himself. Then he nodded, a slow, deliberate gesture. "All right," he said. "We'll see what else needs fixing tomorrow." Evan's heart thumped in his chest as he stepped back, letting Lucas move freely. The simple, unremarkable task of repairing a table had become something more, something charged, something that lingered in his thoughts long after he left the garage. As he walked toward the kitchen, he found himself glancing over his shoulder, half expecting Lucas to be there, half hoping he would be. That night, Evan lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. His thoughts were a tangle of admiration, confusion, and an unfamiliar longing. He told himself it was nothing, just a moment of connection, nothing more, but the memory of Lucas's hands, the warmth, the presence, refused to let him rest. He realized, with a mix of fear and anticipation, that this was only the beginning. Something had shifted, subtle yet undeniable, and he wasn't sure he was ready for what came next, but he couldn't stop thinking about it either. The garage, the table, the careful guidance of Lucas's hands, they lingered in his mind like a spark. And for the first time in a long while, Evan wondered what it might feel like to step closer, to cross the invisible line he had always been told to respect, to see just how far this quiet fascination might go. The next morning, Ethan told himself he wouldn't go near the shed. He rehearsed excuses, errands, phone calls, any diversion that might keep him occupied. Yet as the sun rose higher and shadows stretched across the fields, his resolve faltered. By midday, he found himself pacing near the fence line, his chest tightening at every sound of Marcus's footsteps. When Marcus finally appeared, he carried no tools, no props of casual pretense. His eyes met Ethan's, steady and unflinching, and with a simple tilt of his head, he motioned toward the shed. Ethan followed without a word. Inside, the air felt different than before, warmer, thicker, as though it had absorbed every secret they'd left behind. Marcus closed the door with deliberate care, his hand lingering on the latch. The faint shaft of light through a crack in the wood illuminated his face, softening the sharpness of his jaw, and Ethan realized that this wasn't about small talk anymore. They stood in silence, the kind that wasn't empty but charged, humming with intent. Marcus stepped closer, his presence commanding and yet hesitant, as though he was testing the limits of his own restraint. Ethan's breath came shallow, his body braced for a touch he both dreaded and longed for. Marcus reached out, brushing the back of his fingers across Ethan's hand. It was a fragile gesture, almost tentative, but it carried the weight of unspoken promises. Ethan didn't pull away. That single act, small, fleeting, was the spark that ignited everything. What began with a touch grew bolder each day. Their meetings in the shed became routine, almost ritualistic. Marcus would find reasons to slip away, claiming he needed to check supplies or repair something that could easily have waited. Ethan would already be there, waiting in the dim light, his pulse hammering with a mixture of anticipation and guilt. The first time Marcus kissed him, it wasn't hurried. It was careful, deliberate, as though he needed Ethan to understand this was a choice, not an accident. Ethan felt the world tilt, the rough wood at his back grounding him as Marcus's lips pressed against his. The kiss was both tender and desperate, the culmination of every stolen glance and restrained silence. Afterward, Marcus pulled away, his eyes searching Ethan's face as if waiting for regret to surface. Instead, Ethan whispered, "You don't have to explain." And Marcus, visibly relieved, let the moment linger without justification, but desire, once unleashed, refuses to stay hidden. Their embraces grew longer, their hands bolder, their silences louder. The shed echoed with hurried breaths and whispered confessions, each encounter stitching them closer together and yet tightening the noose of secrecy around their necks. Ethan often thought of Clara, though not with malice. Her presence was like a shadow that neither of them acknowledged within the shed's walls, yet she existed in every hesitation Marcus showed. Ethan told himself he wasn't stealing, Marcus was offering. Still, the thought gnawed at him in the quiet moments, when Marcus wasn't there and the shed stood empty, holding the weight of what they'd done. One afternoon, Clara's voice floated faintly across the yard while Marcus and Ethan lingered inside. The sound froze them both. Marcus pressed a finger to his lips, his eyes wide with something between fear and thrill. Ethan's heart pounded, adrenaline surging as he imagined the door creaking open, Clara's face appearing in the crack of light. But she didn't come. Her voice faded, leaving only the echo of their ragged breaths. When the danger passed, Marcus laughed softly, shaking his head. "Too close," he muttered. Ethan managed a shaky smile, though deep down, the brush with exposure left him shaken, yet the risk seemed only to intensify Marcus's determination. The more dangerous their meetings felt, the more insistent he became. "I can't stop," Marcus admitted one evening, his forehead pressed against Ethan's. "Even if I should." Ethan, caught between conscience and craving, didn't trust himself to answer. Days blurred into a pattern: anticipation, secrecy, indulgence, and guilt. Ethan found himself rearranging his life around Marcus's visits. Each knock at the shed door was a surge of electricity, each farewell a dull ache of absence. He began to wonder if Marcus felt the same hollow loneliness in the hours between. Marcus shared pieces of himself in fragments. He spoke of childhood memories, of dreams he'd once had before settling into the life he now lived. Rarely did he mention Clara, except in passing, as though she were part of a script he recited out of obligation. Ethan listened, storing each confession like a treasure, believing they meant something deeper, that Marcus's heart leaned toward him, even if his life did not. The tension, however, was impossible to ignore. Ethan began to sense the question building inside him, an unspoken plea he was afraid to voice. Was he merely a secret, or was he someone Marcus would ever choose in the daylight? That question grew louder with every touch, every kiss, every hurried whisper in the shed's shadowed walls. And though Marcus never offered an answer, his eyes sometimes betrayed a vulnerability that made Ethan believe he wasn't alone in his torment. Then came the evening when Marcus lingered longer than usual. The shed was cloaked in near darkness, the last sliver of light fading outside. He didn't move to leave, didn't mention Clara waiting in the house. Instead, he rested his hand on Ethan's cheek, his thumb tracing a slow, tender line. "I wish," he began, but stopped, swallowing the rest. Ethan's chest ached. He wanted to demand the end of the sentence, to know what Marcus wished for, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he leaned into the touch, letting silence speak for both of them. The shed, once a refuge, now felt like a pressure chamber. The more time they spent inside, the more the outside world threatened to break through. Clara's presence loomed unspoken, the risk of discovery sharpened with each passing day, yet neither of them seemed willing to let go. By the end of that week, Ethan realized something had shifted. What began as stolen moments of passion had become something heavier, more consuming. He wasn't sure if it was love or obsession, but he knew it was no longer simple, and as he closed the shed door behind him one evening, the air cool against his skin, he sensed the weight of an unasked question pressing harder than ever. Was Marcus prepared to choose him fully, or was Ethan destined to remain the shadow in the shed, hidden from the light of day? The answer hadn't come yet. But it was approaching. Ethan could feel it, a storm building on the horizon, promising to change everything. Evan returned to the garage that evening, carrying a small box of nails and screws as an excuse to prolong his presence near Lucas. The fading light slanted across the dusty floorboards, casting long shadows that intertwined with the tools and lumber scattered around. The air smelled faintly of sawdust and linseed oil, but beneath that was something warmer, almost electric, a subtle current that made Evan's pulse uneven. Lucas was at the workbench, carefully aligning a plank, his back straight, shoulders broad even in the dim light. He glanced up as Evan approached. "You're still here," he said softly, a hint of surprise in his voice, though not unkind. Evan shrugged, trying to sound casual. "I thought I could help. You know, finish this before it gets too late." Lucas studied him for a moment, the kind of look that seemed to weigh thoughts, measure intentions. "All right," he said finally, stepping aside. "Hand me the screws, will you?" Their hands brushed as they reached for the same object, and Evan felt a jolt, like static passing through his veins. He pulled back slightly, but Lucas's gaze lingered, not judging, not reprimanding, just noticing. There was an unspoken awareness that had taken root over the past days, a quiet acknowledgement of tension neither dared label. As they worked together, the conversation shifted from mechanics to memories. Lucas spoke quietly of his father, the man who had taught him carpentry, the small victories and failures of youth. Evan listened, leaning close, captivated not only by the words but by the warmth of Lucas's presence, the subtle movements of his hands, the slow cadence of his voice. He wanted to reach out, to touch, to close the gap between admiration and something deeper, yet a current of caution kept him restrained. You ever feel like life has hidden corners? Lucas asked suddenly, his eyes on the plank but his tone softer, almost hesitant. Corners where no one looks, where you can be something different. Evan's breath caught. Sometimes, he admitted, more honestly than he intended. I think about that a lot. He felt a shiver at the implication of his own words, the vulnerability of confessing that he often longed to step into something forbidden, something unknown. Lucas nodded slowly, as if he understood without needing explanation. Me too, he murmured. He paused, then added quietly, it's dangerous, though, isn't it? Evan's pulse quickened. Yeah, he whispered. It feels dangerous. For a long stretch, neither spoke. They worked side by side, the rhythm of sanding and hammering filling the space, the proximity amplifying the unspoken connection. Evan's mind was a tangle of curiosity, guilt, and anticipation. Every brush of hands, every accidental touch, every glance that lingered too long carried weight. He told himself to focus on the task, but the pull toward Lucas was magnetic, undeniable. At one point, a plank slipped from the edge of the workbench, and Lucas's hand shot out instinctively, catching it. Evan's hands followed, holding the plank steady alongside Lucas's. Their fingers brushed again, a fleeting contact that lingered longer than necessary. Evan felt warmth flood through him, a mixture of excitement and guilt that left him dizzy. He wanted to apologize, to retreat, but Lucas merely held his gaze for a brief second before returning to his work. You're more helpful than you know, Lucas said quietly. Not just with the work. Sometimes, with everything. Evan froze at the words. Did he mean the task, or the something else? He couldn't be sure, and the ambiguity made his heart pound. I just like helping, he said, voice low, almost a whisper. Lucas nodded, but there was a softness in his eyes that made Evan aware of the charged air between them. The silence returned, heavy and tactile, a weight pressing on his chest. Each movement felt intimate, each shared glance electric. Evan realized that the danger Lucas had mentioned wasn't just in life's hidden corners, it was here, between them, unspoken but palpable. Hours passed, the light outside fading completely, leaving only the glow of the overhead lamp casting long shadows across the garage. Evan's hands were rough from the work, his arms tired, but he didn't feel exhaustion. The tension, the awareness, the subtle intimacy, they had a life of their own, igniting every nerve in his body. Lucas wiped his hands on a rag and leaned back slightly, his expression thoughtful. We make a good team, he said. Maybe, sometimes, it's easier to work in silence, don't you think? Evan nodded, though he felt a jolt at the implications. Silence had become a language between them, a language of touches, glances, proximity, and restraint. It was dangerous, intoxicating, and utterly consuming. I should probably go, Evan said after a moment, though he wasn't ready to leave. His fingers lingered on the edge of the plank, as if holding on to something unspoken. Lucas looked at him, his expression unreadable for a moment, then softened. Yeah. Probably a good idea. He didn't move to stop him, but the quiet understanding between them made the word good feel layered, loaded with meanings neither would speak aloud. Evan stepped back toward the door, every step heavy with awareness. He turned once, catching Lucas watching him, and for a fraction of a second, their eyes met in a way that felt like acknowledgement, a recognition of the unspoken bond that had grown between them. Evan's heart raced, a mixture of thrill and apprehension, a dangerous awareness that this moment was only the beginning. As he closed the door behind him, leaving the dim light of the garage behind, Evan's thoughts refused to settle. The day's work, the stolen glances, the accidental touches, they all replayed in his mind with vivid intensity. He told himself he was imagining things, that Lucas's gestures were merely casual, but deep down he knew it was more. The quiet tension that had grown over days now hummed in his chest, a persistent, insistent current that refused to be ignored. He realized, with a mixture of fear and anticipation, that something had shifted irreversibly between them. The line had not yet been crossed, but its presence loomed, inevitable, and tantalizing. Evan lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, replaying each detail, the brush of fingers, the warmth of proximity, the soft weight of Lucas's gaze. The awareness of desire mingled with guilt, each thought both thrilling and terrifying. He understood, in that moment, that what had begun as simple curiosity had grown into something far more complicated, forbidden, and irresistible. Tomorrow would come, and with it, the unspoken tension, the magnetic draw, the hidden possibilities. And Evan knew, with a certainty that both excited and frightened him, that neither he nor Lucas could ignore it forever.